even at the time of this recording, there has been a lot of development recently on this issue. This has kind of been a months or I guess years long issue that's been debated and discussed here in Utah, the legislative level, the judicial level. And I really want to have a conversation to help our audience make sense of this in a way that they can be more informed as they're talking about this issue with others, as they're seeing news coverage and the focus on the Constitution that's being important and these process questions. And so with all of that, Taylor, if I can start with you, maybe just kind of give us your overall thoughts on kind of where things stand. And I'm really thinking, how did we end up here where we have an instance where a judge, Judge Gibson, ultimately was one who selected a congressional map that's now sort of the focal point of this debate. Just give us your perspective on the latest developments on this issue.
Wow, Nick, where to start? I mean, we are really today even following right on the heels of a press conference held by Utah's legislative leadership announcing a special session for December 9th, during which the Utah legislature will consider a few different options as they continue the battle over redistricting here in Utah. I want to be careful that I'm sharing my opinion here, but I think I have some facts behind me. And my opinion, Nick, is that this map chosen by Judge Gibson is, in my opinion, the most egregious case of partisan gerrymandering in modern history. And I say that because we have a district now that is, on paper at least, 52% Democratic voters, when here in the state of Utah statewide, only 14% of all registered voters in Utah are Democrats. In Salt Lake County, only 22% of all registered voters are Democrats. Yet we now have the first congressional district that packs the most progressive, the most liberal and democratic portions of all of Utah into one congressional district. That is now, Bill, you can correct me here because it's not often I get to say things like this with a constitutional fellow looking over my shoulder. So jump in if I'm wrong. But in my opinion, not being an attorney nor a constitutional expert or fellow, Bill, but in my eyes, this is an egregious example of partisan gerrymandering, the very thing that Proposition 4 promised voters it would fight. Back then in 2018, and I was close to Proposition 4 into better boundaries. I've been directly or indirectly close to this organization since its inception back in 2016. At that time, Prop 4 was sold to Utah voters promising a fair map drawing process, fair redistricting, input from an independent redistricting commission, all with the goal of generating more fair, more competitive elections. Fast forward to today, I believe Prop 4 has done the exact opposite of what it promised voters it would accomplish.
Taylor, can I follow up with you on that? And then, Bill, I want to bring you in on the constitutional side, as Taylor mentioned. But, Taylor, that seems to be a critical point that, at least in my view, I don't think is getting enough discussion in the news coverage, that even the folks who have been frustrated with Utah's congressional boundaries, I know there are various arguments on different sides of that issue, but for the folks who feel frustrated about the way the boundaries have been in the past, the arguments that I hear most often is that the broad principle we should all be pushing for are more competitive districts. And obviously you group like communities together, and I know there are a slew of guidelines that are intended to be followed when going through that process. But kind of to your point is that even just from a good governance, good election policy standpoint, there's a very good argument to make that competitive districts help politics to be better, because then you're trying to persuade the middle rather than pushing to the extremes. Is that sort of the correct conception of what the arguments for a redistricting process have been in Utah? And then again, apply that to kind of where we've landed, at least so far.
Yeah, I think you really hit it spot on there, Nick. And I can speak to this as someone who has devoted my career to one single goal, and that is improving voter participation in Utah's elections. I have put all of my career right in that effort. And, here we have, well, let me back up. We spend a lot of time fixated on the frustrations around the first district and how that is a partisan gerrymander. However, the problem is now statewide. We have 4 congressional districts that are not even remotely competitive. We have 3 R plus 40 to 50 Republican congressional districts, and we have 1 very, very Democratic district. None of those districts are going to be competitive at all when it comes to November. And so, exactly as you mentioned, Nick, we're going to now have 4 members of Congress in Utah that are going to ignore the middle. They're going to ignore the center because they will spend all of their time and attention and energy and resources messaging to the fringe extremes within their party because of how these districts are drawn. The center, the middle, you and I, the rest of those Utah voters that lived somewhere between the extremes of the parties, we will not have a voice or a say in our congressional members. That is a huge, huge problem as a consequence of the map chosen by Judge Gibson.
Bill, Taylor mentioned kind of the constitutional angle, and thanks, Taylor, for that kind of political breakdown, because again, this is one of those issues that maybe is not uncommon these days, but I think 3 things kind of blend together, multiple things kind of blend together where, again, from what I see or what I hear, most folks debating this or arguing this that are on the sort of the pro side of this new map are framing it in terms of political outcomes. Well, as Taylor, you mentioned some of the stats. You said there's 14% of Utahns are Democrats, 22% of Salt Lake County are Democrats. So some have said, well, Democrats need representation in Congress. And in my view, it's almost like they're pushing for a gerrymander to create a safe blue district. And so there's the sort of the political debate that's happening, which, of course, the political outcomes are things that should be debated. But Bill, you've written about and spoken about extensively, you've been on the show talking about this, that a missing piece of this is the Constitution. And again, as also a non-attorney, non-constitutional fellow like you are, to me, it seems that before we even should be having a political conversation, we first need to answer the constitutional question. Can you answer that for us, just so the audience understands how we should be thinking about this?
I can try, at least. And it's a great question. I don't know that there's a lot of stock to put in the word fellow. I don't know. I'm not ever quite sure what that means in the title. But well, so what I think it's important to sort of think about this from a very basic perspective. What does the Utah Constitution say about who decides what legislative districts will be? That's an actual really easy question, because the language is pretty sparse. It says the legislature shall divide the state into legislative districts, or into districts for election purposes. So in a way, that's simple, and it tells us who cannot draw the legislative districts. It can't be unelected people, it can't be advocacy groups, it can't be the courts. It has to be the legislature. One thing I think that's important to think about related to that is that there must be a reason, or let me say this differently. There's a great value that promotes, and that is that decisions about legislative districts, about voting, will always have a tie to elected officials. So that means there's always a tie to voters. And that's prioritized. At the federal level, the U.S. Supreme Court has held that the question of how legislative districts are decided is non-justiciable, meaning the courts have no role to, at the federal level at least, in determining how whether or not a particular map is going to be a good map or a bad map, even though people sue and they say, oh, it's not fair. And I think that's wise, because the Constitution doesn't give these other branches authority to think about that. Now, having said that, it's also important to think about, so if one of the values that division of power serves is a link and accountability to voters, what do voters want, and how can they have that sort of carried into effect through the law when the decision making is pretty clear? I mean the line of authority to make that decision is clear. I think one answer, of course, is they can vote for legislators who are responsive to their concerns. I think, and there's more they can do too. They can, they can, like with Proposition 4, they can suggest that the legislature prioritize certain values over others. One of the things that seems clear for me as an outsider a little bit to this issue, because gerrymandering is not, borders aren't all that interesting. The Constitution really is, from my perspective. But it appears that one of the biggest concerns most people have is that this decision should be made on factors other than partisanship. And so, in other words, we shouldn't be looking to say, wow, we need more, we need the map to consistently deliver either Republican or Democrat results. And I think that's probably consistent with the expectations of the framers of the Utah Constitution, who were not wanting to sort of promote one party or the other. And it's interesting to me that the constitutional system allowing the legislature connected to the people who are holding them accountable is more likely to produce that result than the system we have that we're looking at currently, where it appears that some advocacy groups and some judges, whether that's intentional or not, I certainly am not arguing it's intentional, but have created a map that seems almost to focus entirely on partisanship, and in the name of fairness, which I think most people see as a procedural thing, that we're not trying to tip the balance in favor of any particular group or interest. We've actually done the opposite and said, well, okay, we've got one party here, we've got one party here. Let's make sure each gets a fair share of seats. And that's exactly what I think voters never wanted to see happen. And I don't think the Constitution is designed to create that result. But that's where we are, and so that should shape our response to what's happening currently.
Bill, a quick follow-up, and then we do need to take a break, but when we come back from the break, there's some new survey data we have from Sutherland Institute that I want to share and ask you both to respond to. But Bill, you mentioned this idea of sort of what voters want. And as I mentioned, we'll get into some of the survey data that helps answer some of that in the next segment. But I want to ask, because again, the arguments I hear, if I can kind of sort of channel devil's advocate, they're not necessarily persuasive to me, but this is what people are concerned about, at least the folks on the other side of this, that it seems like there is a perception among voters, some voters at least, that what people actually want, what voters want, is the crux of the debate. Because there are some who say, well, wait a minute, why do we even have ballot initiatives like Prop 4 if the legislature can change those after the fact, or if the legislature does something else? And I can understand that angst, that frustration, but can you put that into context, either, how we are supposed to act through our legislative representatives as well, or through the lens of the Constitution? Just help respond to someone out there who says, well, I want the people's will to be manifested, and if ballot initiatives like Prop 4 are not able to be successful the way these folks maybe anticipate, help put that into the legal, legislative, constitutional context properly.
That's a great question, and a fair concern, a fair thing to raise, because of course we want government to be responsive to people. The way that the framers of the Utah Constitution intended for that to happen, or the way they created for that to happen. So I'm not talking about their subjective intent, but just kind of what they wrote down is that. They ensured that those decisions would be made by people who have to live around and be accountable at pretty regular intervals to the people who they're representing, people who have these strong opinions. Now, in order to sort of expand the ability of voters to push legislators in a way that they feel is important, we also have a ballot initiative measures that allow for the voters to say, look, we're talking to our legislators, we're voting in certain ways, but we want to stress that this is a particular result we want. That is, and that's a valuable. Many of the Western states have taken that approach, and it can be a powerful backstop when it appears to voters that their representatives are not responding to them. But having said that, we always have to maintain the accountability issue, so the Constitution, in allowing both for the legislature to have power to make laws, but also for the people to directly make some laws, is to allow them to kind of be in a dialogue with each other. And we didn't like the way you went with that. We're going to repeal that law that the legislature created, or you haven't done this even though we wanted to. We're going to promote that ballot measure. But there has to always be some deference to the reality that the legislature has to make these final decisions. And there's a good reason for that. And I think this sometimes gets missed in the process. The legislature has to make decisions with values of consensus, compromise, discussion. Ballot initiatives, court decisions are entirely different in terms of what we're trying to do. The ballot initiatives, for instance, are to propose ideas, a kind of a one chance to sort of get a megaphone and say, pay attention. But they can be influenced by a lot of different factors that may tamp down the values of things like consensus, compromise. Judges shouldn't be involved in that question at all, because they're supposed to look at the existing law and just apply it in circumstances as it's essentially written, as is the meaning that it would have for people, an informed person reading that text. So there's a place for all of the branches, and there's a place for the people's initiative power. It's an important place. There's a place for legislators. But if we understand better why the system is divided the way it is, I think we can see that we've got a great system that should be respected and can produce great results, even though it may take some time, and we may need to be patient as we watch for that process to play out.
Bill, one really fast follow-up. Producer Spencer is going to get mad at me for making this segment too long, but I think this is important because I've heard you make this point before, and I just want to capture and ask you to correct or quantify this in a way that our listeners can remember absolutely. Because again, this redistricting debate is a manifestation of the broader debate about the legislature's role versus the people's role through ballot initiatives, and kind of when those two things can coexist, if they can coexist. So if that's sort of the crux of the bigger debate, isn't it correct that nowhere in the Utah Constitution is there language that says that one is greater than the other, meaning that a law passed via ballot initiative or a law passed via the legislature are both just laws, that in the same way a bill cannot bind future legislatures, that whatever is enacted in law is subject to amendment by either a future ballot initiative or a future legislature. I just feel like that component is missed all the time, and that seems important to me.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I that really is critical. And again, it's worth thinking about why. What value does that promote? It promotes a continuing discussion. It promotes the ability to say, well, we tried this, and it didn't work so well. And we see that all the time. I mean, look at so many other states where there's some kind of new idea comes along and tons of funders get behind it, and they go, and I'm from California, so I'll maybe pick on California. They go to voters, and they have a sophisticated ad campaign. They come up with an idea, but then in a couple of years, it's unmanageable. And now what do? Our system is much more responsive to the reality that occasionally we're going to need to make a change, or we need to consider something else. I feel like the legislature in this particular instance was trying to be responsive, maybe not perfectly, because we're never perfect about these things, but trying to be responsive to the concerns that voters raised in the ballot initiative, even if they felt there needed to be some adjustments. And I think that's the way the process works, and that's good. That's positive.
Well, and if I can jump in really quickly here, Bill, you're absolutely right. And in fact, we know that the year after Proposition 4 passed on the ballot back in 2018, the very following legislative session, the sponsors of Prop 4 linked arms with legislative leadership at a press conference and together celebrated a legislative compromise that improved, refined, and protected the Prop 4 language that had passed on the ballot. So even the sponsors behind the litigation at one time stood with the legislature and supported legislative leaders in amending the law that they had passed via initiative because of what Bill just explained so well. There's always going to be a need to amend and alter and create laws here in Utah, and that is why we have a legislature that meets every year to do it.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.